Basu and Godin Notebook. 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 Basu and Godin Notebook.
Arpin, are you getting used to the fact that we don't have any Friday episodes anymore? Because it's weird. It's been a long time since I spoke to you.
Yeah, a whole week. Things happen in a week. It gives us a chance to formulate our thoughts. And I do miss it, but I don't at the same time because it allows you to kind of put some thought into things. And so today, had we had a Friday episode, we would have addressed the draft lottery on Friday, but now we don't have a Friday episode, so we can address it on Monday. But to start, we decided to wait until after the Slovakia-US game at the World Championships to record this podcast. So we will get into some draft talk for sure. And we have mailbag questions, lots of them. We'll get to as many as we can. But first, some thoughts on that game and watching Uri Slafkovsky and Cole Caulfield go kind of head-to-head. They weren't on the ice together that often.
No.
But what'd you think?
Well, first of all, having covered that tournament in the past in Slovakia, I can tell you that the atmosphere in those events is just amazing. And I wish there was more of that European type of atmosphere at NHL rinks. That's for starters. The game itself, I mean, that was more entertaining than, for sure, some of the Toronto versus Boston games that I've seen in the first round of the NHL playoffs. Quite a crazy game. Cool comeback from the Americans. From Caulfield himself, I thought that it was a very quiet game. He didn't. I mean, he was very meh. There was a couple of chances. He played the bumper on the power play, which was reminiscent of his days at the USNTDP when that team was loaded, and he used to be used sometimes in the bumper position. One power play, he fanned twice, like very good occasions. One on top of the circle, and then in the bumper. And then following power play had a very good shot that the goalie Lavash deflected on the net in the back. But apart from that one chance, I thought he was not super noticeable. And Slafkovsky on the Slovakian side, even though you might look at the score sheet and say that he was discreet, he felt his presence. I thought his presence was felt throughout the game. Very involved in the play, created some chances, and on a key goal in that game, the first one from Nemetz, like that shot from the blue line. It all started with him creating a turnover, and he created like a 2-on-0 chance against Trey Augustine. Pospisil could not convert, but that play started the sequence that led to the Nemetz goal. So I think he was really, really involved. The one thing though is that Slovakia was bad at the face-off circle throughout the game, and they decided to start overtime with Slafkovsky, which is arguably their best offensive player. So when you've been so bad in the dot throughout the game, well then what you should expect happened. The Americans won the face-off, and Slafkovsky spent his old first shift trying just to chase the puck and didn't touch it. So maybe that I would have done things differently. Maybe.
Yeah. That 2-0 was against Nedeljkovic. Actually, that Nemetz goal chased him from the game.
Yeah, you're right.
Sent Augustine in there, but yeah. Otherwise, I thought he was impactful, and obviously his importance on the Slovak team is greater than Caulfield's importance on the American team. Like the most noticeable player in their uniform was easily Brady Tkachuk, but Caulfield slowly got sort of edged down the lineup a little bit. He got replaced by Zegras at some point. Joel Farabee actually got more minutes than Caulfield did, and frankly was a more noticeable presence as well. So, but it's just one game, and I think the U.S. has bigger things to worry about. Slovakia looked good. That was a mean, nasty game.
Oh yeah.
Brady Kachuk told Claire Hanna of TSN after the game, he's like, "Too bad there's no fighting." that was his take on some of the aggression. And if you're a Calgary Flames fan, I don't know if you'd be listening to this podcast if you are, but if you're there, Martin Pospisil, man, like
What a troublemaker.
You want a playoff type of player.
Yeah.
You want a guy who would look right at home in the playoffs right now.
Yeah.
Martin Pospisil is that guy. So very encouraging for Flames fans to have a player that's that effective in that agitating physical type of role. Also had 2 assists in the game. And one of his, actually, I'm looking at it now, was was the only guy really to have a good night in the faceoff circle for Slovakia. So we just wanted to see, and honestly, I think watching Slavkovsky in the event, and obviously up until now, they hadn't really faced any stiff competition. They had the exhibition game against the U.S. where Slafkovsky scored that highlight reel goal that everyone saw. But just generally speaking, you can see him embrace his role on this team and his importance to his country. I mean, just the sheer number of Slafkovsky sweaters in the crowd, all the video and photos we're seeing of like the number 20 jerseys, just throngs, like hundreds and hundreds of them. And him kind of coming off the bus, getting mobbed for autographs like this, on the day that the Canadiens cleaned out their lockers, he was being asked about, whether he's used to getting recognized in Montreal or whatever. He's like, here it's easy. If you want to see something crazy, you should come to Slovakia. Yeah. And so we're getting a glimpse of what he means, that the fervor for this guy as the future of Slovak hockey, like the pressure, the weight that is on this guy. And when we heard Nick Bobrov talking about it, Kent Hughes talking about it, but particularly Bobrov, where he mentions, for certain guys, it's for players on the Canadiens, it's the weight of a city. For this guy, it's the weight of a country, and he's carried it for years already. He's only 20, but since he was 16 years old, he's been seen in Slovakia as the guy, the next guy, the guy that's going to follow in the line of Hossa and Chara, some of the great Slovak players they've had. He's that guy right now, and he has to carry it. So, everything he does in this tournament, just keep that in mind, is that he's playing for his country for the first time since his draft year, when he obviously won Olympic bronze and was named Olympic MVP and also played in this tournament and played very well. And it's a lot for him. It's a big load for him to carry. So when you watch him perform, just know that he's performing with that load. And it just shows the extent to which, I think we got the best demonstration of it this season, how the Canadiens kind of nailed that aspect of that draft pick, that this guy, the pressure of Montreal is not going to affect this guy because he has this. And they nailed that, and we saw it in November when he was going through all that struggle. And I talked to him on that locker getaway day, and I asked him about if he remembers scoring in St. Louis on that road trip after the Arizona game, when the Coyotes tweeted out the whole Cooley, when you don't draft Cooley, and had the Vince McMahon meme. And looking back, was able to be like, that was a big weight off my shoulders. Like, first goal, it seemed like everything just kind of just came off me at that point. And I thought back to that time, and you never got that impression that it was that impactful. Like, he was only able to admit it after like months and months, but he's a young guy, puts a lot of pressure on himself, and that might be greater than any pressure he feels externally. But this is where it comes from. Like, he feels that pressure from this environment where the expectations on him are so severely high. And, he didn't dominate the game by any stretch, but I thought he played a very solid game, was physical, was good with the puck, made some nice plays for his teammates, and just kind of played his game. And you saw him on the ice. And you didn't really see Cole on the other side.
No, but you saw Slaf a lot of like the cross ice passes. Mm-hmm. His passing attributes are really high up there.
They pop. Yeah, they
They
pop.
pop. They pop more
Yeah,
than his shooting ability,
yeah, for
and
sure.
because that's his natural instinct. That's what he likes to do. And the thing is, it's rarely hope plays with him. It's not like, oh, you recognize the idea, but it got intercepted. When he tries
Mhm.
it, usually it lands in the
Yeah,
vicinity of the player, not necessarily always directly on his blade, but it's not going to get intercepted all that much. So it's yeah. So it was a strong showing for him. So Slavkovsky was a first pick overall 2 years ago,
Mhm.
and here we are 2 years after discussing yet another first round pick. This time, not first overall, but the Canadiens will have number 5 overall, same as last year. I pivoted quickly. Did you have?
Yeah, that's good. That's good. I was going to do the same.
Okay,
Absolutely.
yeah. And then, I mean, there's a lot of discussions going on. Very it's very animated, and I feel like it's not just compared to last year where are you for or against Matvey Mishkov? There's a lot more components and balls in the air when it comes to that 5th pick right now. Um, I'll let you start, but what's your overall sense of where the Canadians are in terms of not only what they wish to accomplish, but the ins and outs of being number 5 this year, considering the group of players that are available at the top.
Well, it's actually a very similar dynamic, and I think the Canadians have viewed it in a very this way for a very long time. Last season at number 5, they chose to take what they and many other teams felt was the best defenseman in the draft at number
Mhm.
5. They're not going to get the best forward in the draft, obviously, at number 5 in this year, but the possibility exists that they will get the second best forward in the draft. Um, and that's how they've kind of looked at it for a while. Like, even while the season was going along, and the Canadiens had kind of settled into this zone where they could be anywhere 5th to 7th around, like in terms of lottery odds, finishing the season with all those loser points, but still losses settled them into that 5th spot, uh, allowing Arizona and Ottawa to finish ahead of them, but behind them in the draft. Uh, really gave, I think, the Canadians a sense that they're going to be in a similar situation where there'll be Celebrini, and then there's going to be a run on defenseman, and then they can get the next forward. And they were pretty happy about that. Now, I don't know how true that is in reality. And this is going to, I think these sands are going to shift a lot over the course of the next few weeks, going into the combine, coming out of the combine, leading up to the draft. I think, it's the most unstable draft year from 2 onward that we've seen in a while. Last year there were 4 top picks, whatever order you wanted to put them in, there were 4 of them. So Montreal is going to get the next tier of player at 5. This year, not quite as clear. So that's been their thought. The real question is, now that they know exactly who's in front of them, is figuring out what those teams want to do. Now, I think you got Chicago at 2, Anaheim at 3, Columbus at 4, Montreal at 5.
Yeah.
First off, I know I reported that the Montreal Canadiens might consider moving up in order to get their hands on Ivan Demidov. It should just be made clear how extremely unlikely that is. It's just not a likely turn of events. They could try. They probably will try. Ken Hughes admitted as much after the lottery that he's going to do his due diligence and try, but it doesn't happen very often. So expectations should be measured on that.
Yeah, if I may
Yeah.
interject here, the last time that it happened when a team actually traded a top 5 pick, knowing that it was a top 5 pick. So there were picks that were traded like a year in advance or
Yeah.
without top 10 projection that ended up being top 5 picks, but knowingly moving your top 5 pick, it goes back to Marc-André Fleury. The trade for that enabled the Pittsburgh Penguins to draft Marc-André Fleury. So
What year
it's
was that?
It was hold on a second. No, I may be wrong on that, but I think it was 2003.
Yeah, no, in 2008, the Islanders traded out of number 5 to the
Yeah, but
Leafs.
there was a switch of picks for 5 and 8, right?
5 to 7. Yeah, but they
5 to
traded out
7.
of the top 5. I mean, that's
Yeah, but
that's the last time a team traded out of the top 5.
Right.
Traded back out of the top 5. That's
Okay,
2008.
I thought you meant trading up. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, last time a team had a top 5 pick, but no, that's good. 2003 is the last time a team, because that would have been trading out of the top 3. I mean, Marc-Andre Fleury went first overall, so that was he not? Yeah, he was.
Yeah, he was. He ended up
Yes.
being, yeah, sure.
So that's 2003. So anyhow, just shows how rare it is. It hasn't happened since either 2003 or 2008, depending on how you want to measure it. But teams don't do this anymore. So that's one point. Second point is just figuring out what the Blackhawks are going to do. Because if the Blackhawks don't take Demidov, there's a possibility he's there at 5 for Montreal. Like, that's the general sense, that if the Blackhawks pass on him and take the kid out of Michigan State, Lev Shunov, the right shot D, which I think you can make a solid argument they should. There's a strong possibility, or there is a decent possibility at the very least, that Anaheim would pass on him as well, and that Columbus could pass on him as well, and that he would be there at 5 for Montreal.
Yeah, that's true. I think that the Demidov possibility is the most enticing of them all, because even though it's a small possibility, I think that's really an ideal scenario for Montreal. If they don't have, I mean, they could choose to sit there and hope that Demidov falls on their lap at 5. That would be great. And I know that
that's probably what's going to happen. I mean, in terms of them sitting there and waiting, that's probably what's going to happen.
Yeah,
he's going to have to fall in their lap.
Because the thing is, let's say if they wanted to trade up, because we've had some questions on our mailbag about that. If they wanted to trade off to secure Demidov, that would be with the knowledge that one of the teams ahead of them is surely to pick him. If they have a sense that they might go the other way, why spend the extra assets anyway?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that it would be an ideal scenario, and I don't think that the Canadiens haven't had a ton of great things going their way. Apart, maybe, I mean, they got a first pick overall, but I feel like if there's such a thing as puck luck at the draft, I don't sense that the Canadiens have been extremely lucky over the years, either by their rankings or by their choices. Caulfield, yeah, for sure. Caulfield, a lot of things went right for them to draft Caulfield. But that's the sort of same thing that would need to happen this time that year that they
absolutely
drafted Caulfield.
Or like what happened to the Canucks with Quinn Hughes. Like that's the scenario that needs to play out for Montreal to get Demidov, and who knows if, looking back on it, you also have to project how the players that actually get picked in those spots are probably not going to look quite as bad as the players who got picked ahead of Hughes kind of look right now. Yeah.
But I mean, all those, apart from Celebrini, you could find warts on all of those prospects, right? And Demidov, you can question. I mean, he's had a stellar season in the MHL. Really one for the history books, but at the same time, I'm sure that there will be question marks around the fact that it's weaker competition, and if he had done that against better players, it would be even more significant than what it was. Mm. There's also the fact that, contrary to Matvei Mishkov, there was no international tournament where you could see him and assess his play best on best against other nations. So that might be a bit of a hesitation against him. That being said, I think that he's clearly the second most talented forward in this draft class, and
could be the most talented forward. Like, honestly, in terms of pure offensive talent,
yeah.
Like, there's an argument to be made that he has more of it than it's Celebrini. It's the well-roundedness of his game, the pro translatability. There's all sorts of other aspects of Celebrini that make him a better prospect. But in terms of pure offensive talent, you could make a solid argument that it's this kid, that it's Demidov that has the top end of the offensive talent. There's other question marks. He's not the biggest guy in the world. It's not that, and it's not as if he doesn't play a complete game. Like he does, his competitiveness is much less of a question mark than it was with Michkov a year ago.
For sure.
So he has some, but it's really, you could put Macklin Celebrini on just about any NHL team and he could contribute right away. Whereas Demidov, it's going to take a bit more time, and teams have that time. And he only has one more year on his contract with St. Petersburg in the KHL. So the timeline for him is a lot more projectable than it was for Michkov a year ago. But
do you really see Chicago passing on Demidov though?
It's possible. I think it's very possible.
I mean,
for everything we just said. Well, everything you just said is what Chicago would be worried about with the number 2 overall pick. Whereas they have a guy staring them right in the face, an organizational need, a right shot defenseman, big, physical, mobile, staring right at them. Yeah. And he's a projectable player. You know that he will be in your NHL lineup within 2 years and be contributing within 3, probably and that might even be conservative. He's a hell of a defenseman, number 1 defenseman in the draft. He plays just down the road from them. They've seen him a ton. And he fits an organizational, like he's BPA. There's a BPA argument to be made for him, and he fits a need.
For sure.
And so you get the best of both worlds with him. And so it's really, they have a very deep prospect pool. Obviously, they've added to it a lot over the last 2 years, ever since they decided to go full blown into a rebuild. They don't have a prospect like Demidov in their system, at least not that kind of explosive game-breaking style player. They have drafted a lot of kind of undersized forwards. I mean, obviously Bedard, you don't really count that with him, but Frank Nazar, Oliver Moore, like there's not a lot of heft in their pool. So maybe that would be a concern, that adding another smaller guy is not ideal. Yeah. There's various reasons why the Blackhawks might decide to go with Levshunov. It's not as if Levshunov is, I think there's arguments that can be made that this guy is, hell, they could go with Salayev for all we know. Like, honestly, like there's the Salayev question to me is fascinating because of just the unique nature of him. Like, no one saw Simashev going 6th last year. But massive mobile rush. Like, I mean, it's.
Well,
we've never seen a 6'7" defenseman before. Like, I mean, it's been a long time since we've seen a 6'7" defenseman, and the last one turned out pretty darn good after he figured things out.
Well, are you discarding Tyler Myers here? But
yeah, I guess. Yeah. Well, I'm thinking of Chara. Like Chara,
I know you.
Yeah,
I know you are. But Salayev's a better skater than Tyler Myers. Like leaps and bounds.
No, Salayev is the guy who really is going to. I think is the real wild card in this top 5. Like he could mess everything up, and so not mess. I mean, I could easily see a GM falling in love with that guy. And being like, man, that guy, like, you don't get to draft a guy like that every year. Like, that's what made the Canadiens fall in love with Slaf. Like, they saw the frame, the size, the strength, everything all combined. They're like, he's not available every year. Well, you look at Salayev and you're like, that guy's not available every year. This is a rare specimen that we have a chance of drafting. And so, I don't know. I mean, I think Chicago's likely to pick Demidov, but I could see many arguments to be made to pass on him.
It's interesting you mentioned Salayev, though, in the top 5 conversation, because if he is, I think he's the Montreal Canadiens probably their best ticket, and hoping that Caden Lindstrom becomes available for them at 5.
Yeah.
Because otherwise there's a chance that he might go earlier. And so I think obviously it stands within reason to say that they have a better chance at Lindstrom than at Demidov. But Lindstrom is going to be interesting because I mean he played 30 something games this year, and when he started the season, he was not considered as high a prospect as, let's say, Berkeley Cadden.
Mm-hmm.
And has he done this much in so few games to propel himself in such a stratosphere that, say, clear cut, top 5 pick? If that's the case, man, the size goes a long way. There's no doubt that he's a great skater for his size. He's got like good scoring ability. Maybe there's a chance that he might end up more a winger than a centerman, but
Mm-hmm.
and he's still so raw. But I just find it intriguing that this guy who was a 3rd round pick, out of the Bantam draft, where he was drafted in the WHL in the 3rd round,
Mm-hmm.
and then entering the season, many people didn't see him even in the 1st round. Or Bob McKenzie didn't have it like in this top 16 guys, for the top half of the board to start the season. So I think that he's got a package that totally justifies that he could be a candidate at 5. But
Mm-hmm.
you take the fact that he's been such a riser this season in limited action, plus the fact that he seems to have some back issues that are lingering and that could be like worrying some teams heading into the combine. And you say, okay, well, the on paper it looks great, awesome, potential number 1 center, you're the big size big size centerman that everybody's looking for. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
but there are risks involved there. It's not like put it to the bank type of blue chip guy.
No, agreed. And again, I think this is going to be, I think it's worth discussing the late riser phenomenon because the Canadiens in each of the last 2 drafts with their first pick took what some considered to be late risers. I don't know if the Canadiens saw it quite the same way, especially with Slaf, but even with Reinbacher, they had to have seen it the same way because he wasn't even on the radar until the Summer World Juniors that year that was held in Edmonton. Sort of a makeup for the one that was canceled. That's when they first noticed Reinbacher, which is very late in the cycle, right? Like the first time you notice a player is in his draft year, by definition, that's a late riser because you will have already had a lot of viewings and a lot of notes on players before they hit their draft year. So this year there are 3 guys that jump out to me as kind of that potential late riser that might entice the Canadiens. You have Lindstrom, who's less of a late riser, and then you have two of the real late risers who are TJ Ginla of the Kelowna Rockets and Beckett Seneke of the Oshawa Generals. Now, I know that judging on some of the reaction I've seen online from some Canadiens fans whose minds blow up at the mere thought of Beckett Seneke going as high as number 5. I think, based on what I'm hearing, I think people need to get their heads around that possibility. Like it's possible. It's possible, especially when you look at the type of players the Canadiens value when they're at the draft table. That this is the type of guy who has the size, who has the skill, and who really turned it on when it mattered most. And now he's not playing for Oshawa, and they're just getting destroyed in the OHL Championship by London. And so I'm not saying the Canadiens are going to take him at 5 or that they're even considering it, but he's going to go a lot higher than I think a lot of people think is kind of my point. And that's kind of was the case with Reinbacher as well. So to me, if Demidov's gone and the Canadiens get to 5 and none of the defensemen that they would maybe consider making an exception for to take drop to 5. Because I know what Ken Hughes said, but if Salayev gets to 5, they have to consider taking him, right? It's it's got to be at least a conversation. Like,
Doesn't sound like it.
well, I don't think they anticipate him being there at 5. And if he is there at 5, I think they're going to have to discuss it. Like, it's got to be it's got to be a discussion because I think a lot of people, I think there's a lot of legitimate optimism about how this kid would project in the NHL, and the Canadiens. Well, not only the Canadiens, most NHL teams don't have a player like that, and so when you're looking at the scarcity of a player, which is what they did with Reinbacher and what they did with Slafkovsky, well, that applies to Salayev, and so like again, Ken Hughes said what he said, and I'm going to take him at his word, and I don't think he was lying. I think all things being equal, he would like to add a forward with that pick, and if it's not a forward, it would be more of a right shot than a left shot defenseman. But if Salayev's there, despite the fact he's a left shot, I think that's going to be like they might need a timeout during the draft if that happens. That's all I'm saying. Like I think there'd be some heated discussion.
Yeah.
But all that aside, of the Iginla, Seneke, Lindstrom group, like the risks you mentioned with Lindstrom, I think are going to be a real factor here. His combine's probably going to be more important than it was for most people. I think that there was some disappointment from the Canadian side that he didn't show up. Well, not that he didn't show up, that he passed on the U18 Worlds. They would have probably liked to have seen him there. But back issues at that young of an age with that big of a frame can scare some teams off, So I think those other two guys are going to be in the mix, personally.
Yeah, but then again, I mean, it's you mentioned right off the top the fact that we rarely see a team trading up or down from number 5. But if they're, you got to think though that either of these guys, Iginla and Seneke, are legitimate top 5 picks, not only in the Canadiens' eyes but in other teams' eyes, and then they're reaching by drafting either one of them at 5, or you have to consider the possibility of trading down a bit, because if both of those guys, let's say Demidov's gone, Lindstrom is taking pretty high too, and somehow Iginla and Seneke also squeeze in the top 10, all of a sudden it becomes not such a defenseman heavy draft. You might have plenty of good candidates on defense, but if you have all in all 5 forwards that squeeze in, it's more than was originally thought.
Yeah.
The tricky thing is because the Canadiens are, I mean, they almost cornered themselves by saying how much they wanted a forward. To a certain extent, it seems like draft for need, right? But with all those young defenseman prospects available and the rarity of some of those profiles, you might think, okay, well, there will be so many teams eager to identify maybe a top pairing defensive prospects in that group that the Canadiens have the luxury of drafting down, because the likelihood of one of those guys being still around is legit. At the same time, there's no consensus on who are the best defensemen in that group. You mentioned Levshunov, probably number 1. Yeah, okay. But after that, some teams might prefer Dickinson, some teams might prefer Bouillon, some teams might prefer Parik, whatever. And the danger when you draft down is it's hard. I think it's harder to sell a team to trade up when that group of defensemen being so large that those teams could say, you know what, I'll take my chances of staying where I am, and the defenseman that I prefer might still be there because there's no consensus. Because I don't necessarily need to move up in order to secure the one guy that I want, and I'm sure that if I don't do that, he's not going to be there when I'm drafting. So that component, I think, makes it also a bit harder for the Canadiens to consider a trade down. But when it comes to Iginla and Seneke, I mean, I could call me nostalgic, but I like the bloodlines when it comes to Iginla. I'm not always
I'll call you
Uh,
romantic more than nostalgic.
yeah, I guess so. Yeah, I guess that's
Yeah.
what I meant. Usually, it's not an argument that I buy a great deal. It's annoying more often than not. But I happen to like Jerome McGinley a great deal when he was a player,
Yeah.
and I
Well,
think he's a great professional influence on his son. He's training him physically in the off season. They're training together, and
mm,
Iginla's got this massive, massive legs, a lot of strength in the lower body. So despite the fact that he's not huge, he gets out of the corner very often with the puck because he's so strong in his legs and his butt, and I think that's something that compensates for the fact that he might not be the tallest guy. One of the best. One of the best shooters or goal scorers in that draft class, so
yeah.
he's got that going for him. You mentioned when it comes to Lindstrom the importance of the combine. I think that Beckett Zenicky also is going to have an important combine. Because he'll have maybe some questions to answer. Your colleague Scott Wheeler alluded to questions maybe about his character and his compete level. So I think that
Hmm.
teams are going to be interested to see in his interviews, understand the kid a bit more in that within that dynamic, and also just from a physical standpoint, he's a guy that grew from 5'10" to more than 6'2" in what something like 2 years. So
Yeah.
he had a huge growth spurt. You have to be able also to look like horizontally. How much room will he have to grow into that body, fill it
Mhm.
up, and become thick? If there's a lot of room to grow in that body, that then all of a sudden those silky hands of the smaller guy like put on a guy who has all of a sudden become 6'2" and a half.
Mm.
That becomes very enticing if he can just fill in that frame. So I think that the combine will be also very important for Seneke.
So I think this is an important discussion when you talk about trading down in the draft. First of all, it's good. Disclaimer again, as you mentioned, and as we've mentioned, they don't happen very often. But the other motion is oh, it's a reach. And this is something I think needs to be talked about in this year's draft, especially. Um, I think this year more than most years, it's not a. It wouldn't be fair to call anyone in this like from 5 to 10 a reach, just because the group is so diverse. The group of players available are so diverse. Lists from teams, one team to another, are going to vary more greatly than they usually do, which is usually quite. There's a lot of variance between teams. So
Mm-hmm.
when you were saying, there's a big group of players kind of pooled together in the same sort of tier or same range. So we'll just, teams might say, well, we have a good chance of getting our player. Um, if the Canadiens were to play that game, uh, thinking that one of Iginla or Seneke or Lindstrom, I don't know, however things are going to play out, but if they think that they're going to get their guy at 8 or 9 or whatever, um, because of the high variance in this draft and because of the nature of sort of late risers and the nature of playoff style scores that the Canadiens covet, but they're not the only teams that covet them. Um, it's you have to resist the temptation to say, "Oh, that's a reach." What is really, I know that in our mock draft exercise, there were a lot of comments about people because I traded down with Calgary in that exercise. I picked up the
Yeah,
Canucks first round pick, and I was like, man, this is great. And I still get to draft Iginla at number 9. Like, I am GM of the year. Everyone's like, dude, what are you doing? You're crazy. You could have lost Iginla and this. You might as well just. And I thought about it. And in the real world, first of all, in the real world, I don't think Calgary actually makes that deal. Let's be honest. Like, giving up, let's say, the 29th overall pick, or if Vancouver makes it to the final, which I guess they might, 31st or 32nd overall pick, and number 9 to get to number 5, it's probably a little bit too rich. But I think the principle of me offering that deal to our friend Julian McKenzie, who is serving as GM of the Flames, is based on this conversation that we're having. That, well, if I want to take a Ginla, it's silly to take him at 5. I'll move back to 9. Hopefully, he's there.
Yeah.
He could have very easily not been there, and then you look silly. And I actually did the same thing in last year's mock draft, if you recall, where I traded down hoping to get, what was it, Ryan Leonard or Dvorsky. I traded down to 8. And
both of them were gone.
And they went 6-7. So
Yeah.
I didn't get either of them. So it was like I thought I had a good chance of getting one. So, but in this draft class in particular, with so many varieties, like not only so many defensemen, but different varieties of defensemen, these forwards who are kind of emerging late, it's going to be so hard to predict how the draft's going to go. Like starting at 2, from 2 to like 20 is going to be all over the map. And the only person who's going to know what's going to happen is Corey Pronman, and he's going to nail it like he usually does. But otherwise, in terms of teams trying to predict what other teams are doing, so I think that Canadiens fans in particular would be best served sort of ignoring the notion of a reach at number 5, just because if the Canadiens really like someone, if they really like a Ginla, if they really like Lindstrom, if they really like Senek even, which I think a lot of fans are having trouble getting their heads around, but if they do, and they come up at 5, they should probably just take them and be done with it. Because the argument I made in the draft last year after Ryan Backman was taken at 5, and I believe it, and I still believe it, is that the draft is more about team building than it ever has been before. You're projecting guys to be in your lineup a lot sooner than you used to. And not only be in your lineup, but be effective. And yes, it's becoming more rare for kids to come straight out of the draft and into the NHL. But what's becoming more common is, even if it takes them 2 or 3 years, the amount of time it takes them to be sort of impact players or have an impact on your fortunes, I think has grown shorter than it used to be back in the day. So I really honestly believe that the draft, there's a team building aspect to it. And if the Canadiens feel that they need a big scoring playoff style winger to fill out their top 6, then they should go get that player. Even if at number 5, it seems like a bit of a reach.
Well, I guess that goes in with the question that I asked Kent Hughes right after the lottery. I mean, it's okay that that's what they're going to be looking for, but at the same time, they're the group of scouts that's led by Nick Bobroff and Martin Lapointe will sit down and spend weeks to elaborate their list, and they'll know that ultimately there's a preference in drafting a forward. That's obvious, but
that's coming down from above.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you have to make the legit exercise, the honest exercise of figuring out who is the best player available. And what happens if those guys, after all their meetings, all their viewings, comparing notes, etc., come down with the honest answer that at 5, they have the best player available is a defenseman, and the one after, it's a defenseman. What do you do then? Because do you absolutely have to say, guys, let's organize our list in a way that we're going to make sure that we're going to be in a position to draft a forward. But if you're not, and if you just decide to go build your list based on best player available, there's a non-zero chance that the best player might be a defenseman. And I think that if it happens to be a left-handed defenseman, Kent Hughes is on the record saying that he would look to trade that pick, either trade the pick, move up, move down. It's not unclear, but trade the pick. And otherwise, he said also, and if we're stuck, and because it's a right-handed defenseman, we would consider that possibility. And we would consider what's the gap between that best player who's a right-handed shot and the next one who would be a forward.
Who's a forward, yeah.
What's the separation between those two? So I think that it puts the scouts in a tough position, because they don't necessarily. It would serve them well all of a sudden say, you know what, we had Seneki top 4 on our list, or we happen to have three or four forwards on our top 5, and they're all ahead of Lev Shunov, and they're all ahead of Parik and Dickinson.
Yeah.
Okay. It's
Oh.
to me it seems like a risky territory.
Well, I'll go one further. I agree with what you say, and it's true that you're not going to build a draft board with the knowledge that you shouldn't build a draft board specifically geared towards one position or another. You should build it based on hockey players. And I think I saw Kyle Davidson, Kyle from Chicago, in Chicago, the Blackhawks GM, talking about how how they're going to evaluate them as hockey players. And, the big question in Chicago is this Lev Shunov versus Demidov debate is going to be endless from now until the draft in Chicago. But my point is, and so I agree that that's not the way you should go about building a draft board. What I began thinking of, especially when Kent said that we have a lot of left shot D, if it was a right shot D, would we consider it?
Mm-hmm.
They took a right shot D last year. And he even said then, if he was left shot D, we might not have taken him. So that was a team building exercise. We needed a right shot D, so we took him at number 5. Now they're still open to taking a right shot D, so do they not see, if they're open to taking a right shot D at number 5, that means you don't necessarily see Reinbacher as a top pair defenseman necessarily. Yes, I understand their depth on the right side is less than the left, but you're talking about the top end of your pool, not the bottom end of your pool when you're drafting 5th. So that's one thing. Second thing, you look at all the players on the left side, and I'm going to leave Matheson out of it for now, but just in terms of young defenseman prospects, not to say that Matheson's not in the picture, but do any of Caden Gooley, Arbor Jacki, Jordan Harris, Jaden Struble, who am I leaving out? Adam Engstrom. Do any of those 5 guys scream number 1 defenseman to you?
No, but I could see
Gooley maybe.
Gooley being a number
2/3, right?
Yeah,
and
he could be a top pairing guy. He would not be the offensive part of that duo, but I could see him on a top pairing.
Agreed. 100% agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed. And Lane Hudson in that list. So Lane Hudson could be great. Will he be a number 1 defenseman? It's really tough to project him in that way. If he follows the path of Quinn Hughes and becomes that guy, then great, but it's hard to bank on that. And David Reinbacher, I think is a guy who falls into a similar category where he's probably going to make a good 2-3 or a complement to a guy like Lane Hudson. Point being, yes, the Canadiens have a lot of really good defense prospects, but they don't have a guy that screams number 1 defenseman. And to me, that's the issue I have, that if you have an opportunity to draft one, I think by a lot of accounts, this Salayev kid could become a number 1 defenseman. If he's available, even though he shoots from the left, and you told everyone that you have a lot of left shot D and this, that, it just seems to me that you haven't filled that spot on your team. Mm-hmm. This is going to be our number 1 guy. But it also strikes me that this administration is very sensitive to public perception, more so than they were before the Reinbacher pick. I think the reaction to the Reinbacher pick freaked these guys out a little bit to some extent. And I think they know that if they draft a defenseman again after what happened last year, that it could be even worse. And it might be shaping what they're doing, what they're going to do at the draft, or at least why they're publicly stating their preference for a forward so strange, oddly transparently, this far ahead of the draft.
That's true. It would be a nice hand of poker from Kent Hughes if all of a sudden he ended up drafting a defenseman,
I mean,
let alone a left-handed defenseman.
absolutely. But I mean,
Left shot defenseman. Yeah.
left shot defenseman, and but you could totally like if the Salayev kid is there,
Yeah.
like he could easily go up on that stage after the draft and say, "Listen, I know I said what I said. The kid's 6'7". He moves really well. He's going to be a mainstay on our blue line for 10, 15 years." And it's going to be our best defenseman for all that time. Like I couldn't say no to this kid. This kid does not come around every year. We had to take him, and I don't think anyone would blame him for that. Like I don't think it's not an unreasonable thing to say if that kid were to be available. Like
No, it's not an unreasonable thing to say in isolation, but when you pair that with the choice of Reinbacher last year, then it becomes. It makes it sound as though we drafted Reinbacher last year because we thought he could be a number one defenseman on our team, and he was better than either like the Russian Phenom that we were not high on, and that industrious playoff performer type of guy that Ryan Leonard is, and 12 months later you draft another guy. It almost sounds as though we're not that sure about Reinbacher anymore. And to me, that's, you talk about public perception. I think that's what it would be. You could easily argue, say, you know what? Our team this year we have plenty of good prospects on defense, but we don't have a sure shot first defenseman. He's that guy. You could argue that, but I think that you pair that with Reinbacher, it becomes, and not only that, it becomes especially delicate knowing that they drafted Reinbacher because they thought that Reinbacher had an overall package that none of this year's defensemen had. So it's in the evaluation also of comparing Reinbacher to Levshinov, to Salayev, to Dickinson, and all the other ones. So I think that there was a lot of pushback because of the Reinbacher pick last year because of Mishkov. But in itself, forget Mishkov, just choosing Reinbacher, they've got la tête sur le billot, we say in French. They've put a lot of stock in that pick, and Bobroff and Lapointe might be they'll be judged in part for that. They're in a few years from now, we'll have to see if it was the right pick or not. But it's tricky because the need itself, the need is clearly at forward, but you don't want to reach to fill your need either. So, and trading down is a risky proposition. So all in all, there's no magic formula. So you really have to hope
there isn't.
That Demidov or a healthy Lindstrom ends up being there at 5.
But I think the other two guys we mentioned, McGinley and even Seneke, I think we're going to start to hear more and more stuff about these guys, and they're going to start climbing up lists. I guarantee it. Like as we get closer and closer to the draft, these guys are going to be higher and higher. And Bob McKenzie's last list, he had Seneke at 14, which was up from 19. Cole Yzerman, who we haven't even mentioned, was down to 13. Like seems to just be like a non-option for the Canadiens at 5. So that's how things change. Aginla's up to 10, went up from 16 at midseason on McKenzie's list. So these guys have a tendency to continue rising. Lindstrom was at 5 on that list, and it's I think fans need to be open to a lot of possibilities here. I think that there's a lot left to figure out.
Yeah.
But, Zane Parek's a right shot D.
Yeah.
If
offensively, probably the most creative of that bunch, He might be redundant. He might be redundant if you want to align one day Hudson and you on your blue line. You say, okay, where does Parek fit in all of that? I could understand that, but yeah.
which is why I think the whole BPA thing just goes back to my thing about BPA. Like people, that's another thing that I think people need to get out of their minds. Like this Parrot could be the BPA. Well, I mean, the Michkov argument last year, which some could say applies to Demidov as well. Can you have a top six with Michkov and Caulfield and hope to compete in the playoffs? You could probably make that same argument with Demidov. Can you have a top six with Demidov and Caulfield and hope to compete in the playoffs? Maybe it's less true with Demidov, but it's still a question that needs to be asked. It's still a question the Canadiens need to ask themselves. They've committed to Caulfield.
Yeah.
How many smaller skilled forwards can you have in your top six? Like everyone always talks about Marchessault winning the Conn Smythe, but Marchessault is literally the only guy under 6 feet on the entire team. There's no one else that really. That's a big team. That's just he's surrounded by trees on that team, So there's a certain reality to it that these bigger guys tend to survive the grind of the playoffs better than smaller guys, and I think that's a discussion that Chicago needs to have. If you already have Bedard, and you hope to have Nazar and more in your top six one day. And Reichel's not the biggest guy, is adding another smallish guy, does it make a lot of sense? So,
yeah, but I mean, they're a few years away from wondering how far can we go in the playoffs with that guy.
Right, but they're building the foundation of that playoff team now, right? I mean, they have to try to project these guys into a playoff scenario, and that's what Montreal has to do. Now, listen, having said that, I really do get the impression that the Canadiens see sort of a talent level in Demidov that would allow them to sort of make an exception in his case. But I think these are questions that, the Canadian scouting meeting is going on this week. All their amateur scouts are meeting perhaps as we speak on Monday afternoon. This is a question that's going to come up, I'm sure. I'm sure like months from now when the Canadiens release their behind the scenes draft video, maybe we'll see this discussion happening on that video, but I think it's a legitimate, fair question to ask. And I'm sure they're asking it, but
at 5'11", I mean, Demidov is the same size as Kucherov and Genzel.
Yeah.
And they're
Absolutely.
not considered necessarily bad, or they're bad playoff performers, and they're not necessarily. They're not even considered like small. It's
and look, and Tampa like has Kucherov, Point, Cirelli's not huge. They're not a big group at forward, and even when Palat was there, not a huge guy. Like they were never built on size alone, and there are always exceptions, and so, but it's just
to me, even more than size is how do you manufacture your offense? You can be like below 6 foot, but if you manufacture your offense by being willing to go play between the dots, and you never hesitate to go in the slot, and you're adept at creating your space in front of the net, and you're good at tipping pucks, and you manage your offense in a way that can be reproduced during the playoffs, then it's interesting. The flip side to that is what the Maple Leafs are stuck with Mitch Marner, who's a guy who's very creative, and he has some room in the regular season to manufacture a type of offense that that room is just non-existent in the playoffs, and all of a sudden he doesn't have the same impact. And as a whole, that core four doesn't have the same impact offensively. Obviously, I mean, it's been that horse has been beaten to death, but everybody knows that they haven't been able to score offense in the playoffs. So I think that for the Canadiens, even more than the size, it's what style of hockey are these guys offering us? Are they smaller players that play big? And do they have something that could translate in the playoffs that could, that they could survive not more than survive, that he could thrive in a playoff environment, despite the fact that they're either 5'10" or 5'11" or whatnot.
Yeah. And that's why to me, it's less about BPA than it is about team building. That's really what I feel it is in the draft. Okay. we're coming up on an hour on the show, so if we're going to do the mailbag, I feel like we should do it now.
Sure.
So let's go to the mailbag. We do a mailbag every Monday, you know.
Let's go to the mailbag. Let's go to the mailbag.
Mailbag.
You know, they reach out and they write to us.
Okay, thank you again. All your questions, a lot of interesting ones.
Yes.
Here, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. Okay. Let me see. We've got. Okay. Well, I think let's start with this one from Steve Easter. I think it's an important question for our podcast in general. Sometimes listening to the pod, I can't always tell where you guys stand with the team and their progress, or what expectations you guys have for the team. Where do you each stand with the team for this coming season? Well, I think that there are two questions in there. First is, where do we stand in the rebuild, and where do we stand with the next season? Which, I mean, whatever happens next season to me is still a bit secondary. I think overall I support what Hughes and Gorton have been doing. I think that I agree with their approach. And I know that there are some people who thought that the Canadiens should have properly tanked the way that Chicago and San Jose have been doing it in order to get like a star at the top of the board. The Canadiens had a number one pick before. It was just not a strong class, but I think that they made the right pick with Slafkovsky. But that very same day, when they traded Romanov for the 13 overall pick, and they decided to flip that pick and trade for Kirby Dach, right then and there, it sent the signal that they would not do like a full-on rebuild, a scorched earth type of rebuild, and that they would find ways to make sure that it's not something that takes too long. So they were already at the bottom, and from that point on, it was not how can we stay at the bottom for a few more years in order to get the best prospects, but how can we get back up? And so I think that first signal there, that trade, was the first sign of the direction that they had decided to take. So I think you can do some morning quarterbacking of was it the right course of action? I think that you look at the Montreal Canadiens and with Suzuki and Caulfield and a few other very interesting pieces that they already had. Suzuki was finishing his entry-level deal. If you decide to go scorch earth and like tear it down completely and start from scratch, basically by the time, but you choose to hold on to quality pieces like Suzuki, it means that the team is going to be competitive only the day that Suzuki reaches free agency after after like 10 years in the league or something. So I think they thought that they had too many quality pieces at hand to do a full-on rebuild. But what they're doing, I think, still qualifies as a rebuild. But again, I think that they need some of those picks to really turn favorably. And I think that there might be, my last point will be this one, is as much as the Dach trade has been labeled an accelerator and Newhook has been called an accelerator, there's also the fact that there are things that are done to accelerate that process, but there's also a will from that organization to make sure that they don't precipitate some of the other prospects that they have and don't put them into like a tough situation too quickly. So it might look as though it contradicts itself that you have accelerating moves and then let's not precipitate things with other, but it's not the same players that we're talking about here. Some moves were made to make sure that the process would not take forever, but once you have prospects in your pipeline, you want to make time. You want to take the time that it needs to develop them properly and make sure that you give them the best chance to develop and become like NHL contributors. So all in all, I think that they're balancing these two things rather well. I'm still hesitant to see if they've got enough of game-breaking talent that will enable them not only to be a good playoff team, but a Stanley Cup contender. That remains to be seen, in my opinion. But so far, I think I'm pretty down with what they're doing. How about you?
Yeah, it's the thing that you have to realize that's incredibly difficult in a rebuild is identifying your window to kind of go for it. And the Canadiens are nowhere near that right now, but I think they don't want to be so far from it that they can't react. I think they want to be in a position to react to when their younger core players tell them it's time for them to kind of kick it into another gear, that they not be so far from that gear that they're not in a position to react. So I think that this stage of what they're trying to do is to put them in a position where they're right there and allow these players to continue growing, allow the young defensemen to start accumulating experience so that they can really get closer to where they'll be when they're contributing to a winning team. And then when you're there, probably 2 to 3 years from now, and you're close, then you can shift into finishing. Like, right now they're still painting with a roller. Eventually they're going to have to get the little paintbrush out and finish all the details around it, as long as you do the roller well. Yeah. But they're still painting with a roller right now. But they want to get enough of it done so that when it gets time to finish all the edge work, that's all they have left. So they only have like a couple hours left, and you've done the bulk of the rest of the work already. And so that's what they're doing now. They're doing the bulk of that work, and I think it's going relatively well. I think the lack of top end talent remains a concern, just because this management group, the scouting staff, everyone always says we look at playoff hockey and that's how we like to build our team. Now, I definitely think more so now than I did a year ago at this time that perhaps they have an alpha male kind of character in Juraj Slafkovsky. I think Nick Suzuki's ceiling is probably higher than we gave him credit for a year ago at this time. I think the work that Cole Caulfield did this year showed that he's more interested in winning games than simply scoring goals. And from a character point of view and an attitude point of view, he showed a lot. But it's hard to look at this group of forwards and not have questions. There are question marks in this forward group. And they're missing one, if not two, forwards that you don't really have question marks about. Yeah. Now, I personally think Suzuki and Slaf, I don't think we're going to have question marks about them when they reach their prime. And Suzuki's probably in his prime now, but when Slaf reaches his prime, they need a couple more of those. And so...
Yeah, because there are question marks on Caulfield, on Doc, to a certain extent on Newhook, even if he might not be a top 6 guy when it's all said and done.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right.
So that's what we have to see happen, but I don't think it's wrong for them to think that it's time for them to take a step and to show something more than what they've shown since this administration came in. Okay, there's a similar type of question that kind of dovetails somewhat nicely out of that, or it might just be redundant. But we had a question that, sorry, let me find it. Where'd it go? Okay, so this comes from Chris. Chris asked, it seems crazy to think that it has been 21 years since Bob Gainey started his tenure as GM of the Habs. This makes me realize that every time the Canadiens make major administrative changes, it takes a better part of a decade to play out. We are still living with the decisions, both good and bad, of the Bergevin administration. Given this, it makes me question the direction of speeding up the rebuild by targeting Newhook Doc type trades. If your team only gets to rebuild once every 10 years, shouldn't one resist the urge to take shortcuts? The most successful teams the last 10 years, Chicago, Tampa, Colorado, Pittsburgh, all endured long, tough rebuilds with the appropriate amount of patience. the fact you have a 24-year-old captain doesn't seem to warrant doing this all over again in 2030. Now, this is similar to another question that came in from Andrew, who also said, as a contrarian exercise, wouldn't it be better to just do nothing this offseason? And basically laid out a lineup that he thought could be made up of players that are currently here, and it looks fine. But it's the same sort of argument that Chris is making, that they should do this right and not seek shortcuts. To which I would respond personally, the reality today is not the same as the reality even when Chicago was winning cups. Flat cap has changed things. The rising cap is going to change things further, and I think this team is positioning itself to play in a cap world that has a lot more flexibility to it. If you look at the Carey Price contract coming off the books in 2 years, I think that's sort of a window, and then not long after that, Anderson and Gallagher's contracts coming off the books. Like, I really do think that the Canadiens are trying to set themselves up to hit that window as competitive. And, when you mentioned the most successful teams the last 10 years going through long, hard rebuilds, it's too convenient to leave out the teams that went through long, hard rebuilds and never came out of them. Buffalo being one of them, Edmonton to some extent being another. Like, they've been in a very, very long, hard rebuild. They still haven't won the Stanley Cup despite having this generation's greatest player and a top 5 player of this generation as well on the team at the same time. How many times they had to get the number 1 overall pick before they could get McDavid and get Draisaitl, which wasn't even with a number 1 overall pick. And so yes, the successful teams did it in a certain way, but not every team who did it that way was successful. That's what needs to be. Look at Toronto. Toronto did it that way, and they're on the verge of blowing it up. Like, it didn't work.
Look at Arizona. Look at Arizona, how they've been rebuilding forever, and yet they had a number 5 pick. They had a number 3 pick in 2015, Dylan Strome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Wrong guy to take at number 3. They had a number 5 pick in 2018, Barrett Hayton, which was driven by position. And they had a number 3 pick in 2022, Logan Cooley, which is a good pick for what it was. But that's a team that's been at the bottom for so long. It's been selling assets left, right, and center, collecting a ton of second-round picks. But
never picked first overall.
Never picked first overall, never picked second. Yeah. And they don't, for all the assets that they accumulate quantity, but not that much, not more than anybody else in the top 10.
So whenever you find yourself saying, "Oh, the teams that won did it this way," just think of the teams that didn't win that did it that way. Like, that's my point, is that you can't just cherry pick the teams that won and say they did it that way, we should do it that way too. A lot of teams have tried to do it that way and it's failed. And more teams have failed doing it than have succeeded, in my opinion. So what I like about this administration is that they're not looking at other teams to chart their path. They're going about it their own way. And I actually admire that. And I think it's a good thing. And that's how I feel. So I don't think they're taking shortcuts. Like, when you call it speeding up or shortcuts or whatever, I think they're just building the team that they want to build, and they're doing it at the pace that they deem is appropriate. And what I would consider a shortcut would be, if they traded, like if they made the Newhook deal, but instead of getting Newhook, they got someone like, I don't know, like just as an example, they got someone like an older guy. I don't know. I can't think of an example, but if they got someone older who didn't fit their timeline, then yeah, that would be an unnecessary shortcut. Some of the moves Detroit made, which I criticize, might work out for them. Like, listen, they're closer to a playoff spot than the Canadiens are, but I still think that JT Compher contract, that Andrew Kopp contract, those are weird contracts to give out when you're those are shortcuts to me. Justin Holl, same deal.
Yeah.
I don't think the Canadiens are taking shortcuts in that sense, so I'm okay with what's going on. personally.
Yeah. When Chris asks about standing pat this offseason, he says, is it really an imperative for the Canadiens to trade young defensemen just because they have more NHL caliber ones than roster spots? I think that's where the tricky thing is that they'll have to, I guess, commit to trade one or more defensemen without being 100% sure of what they will turn out to be. There might be an aspect of gamble behind all this, but standing pat and not doing anything would not solve the issue, especially on defense, because you only have 6 guys. So it's not as though you're going to be able to create an environment where you're going to get like a satisfying sample size at the NHL level for all of the young defensemen that are knocking at the door. If it was at forward, you could probably organize it better. But as it stands, I just don't see, unless there's a crazy amount of injuries, I don't see them being able to give significant NHL reps to all of those young defensemen so that at the end of next season, they're able to say, okay, now we have a clear idea on each of those guys and we can make our moves. And I don't think that you've got really anything to gain at deploying the same lineup at forward. You'll run out the contracts of guys like Dvorak and Armia and whatnot, but the contracts that you're unlikely to be able to move, you'll have to run them out anyway. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I just think if they can improve the team, I don't see why they shouldn't. That's sort of, if you consider that a shortcut or speeding it up unnecessarily, then so be it. But I look at it as them trying to improve the team in a coherent kind of way.
Yeah. Okay. Now let's see. We have a couple of questions. Okay, this one is we've had it before. I think we've touched on it many times, but let's delve into this again. JD Lagrange asks, I personally would not, but would you trade the 5th overall for Trevor Zegras? And what time of return would it take to trade it? I think that's what I see. Okay, this is what I think. That's the point that I wanted to make this topic relevant again. I think that the way hockey players are developed these days, they're super high on individual skills. The level of individual skill is through the roof, nothing like we've ever seen before. And I think that Trevor Zegras is a prime example of that, of, the hand-eye coordination, the soft skills, amazing. And I think that we tend to look at individual skill and put it on par with just high-end talent. And talent is more, there are more components than just the individual puck skill. So I think that we have to make sure that when you look at improving your team and making sure that you're going to get like bona fide top 6 guy or even top line guys, that you're not only looking at the fact that this guy dangles like crazy and he'll end up on the highlight reel, but is he helping your team to win? And I think that's a question with Trevor Zegras, but many of other guys, is because you're going to be blown away by their skill level, but the fact that they're the most skilled, does that make them the best? And I think that there's a nuance that we have more and more evidence with in recent years, that it's 2 separate paths. That's a point that I used to make about Jonathan Drouin, where he was clearly the most skilled on the Canadiens, but he was not the best player. So I think that the Canadiens have to look at guys that are, they need to address their skill level, but they need to look at who could better them and make a guy who could potentially become their best player. And I'm not sure if Trevor Zegras is that guy. And the number 5 pick is a high price to pay for a guy like that. If you are to decide to trade your number 5 pick, it better be for a guy that you won't have that question mark when playoffs come around. You know, you were saying, we don't. You need to get a guy that you're going to be sure about, and that's no surprise if that guy has been in the rumor mill for so long. We touched on Martin Necas in previous episodes. You look at the playoffs right now with Carolina.
Yeah,
he plays. He's so out of sync with the rest of his team, and he plays on the perimeter, holds on to the puck forever, and then he'll lose it on the turnover, and he has opportunities to shoot, and he doesn't. It's like, man, use your skill to the greater good, and sometimes it doesn't happen. So I guess there's always a reason why those guys that are in the rumor mill are not considered, untouchables by their teams. And so JD, I don't think I would trade the number 5 pick for JD for Trevor Zegras either.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add to that. I agree with all that stuff. I wouldn't trade it either. I wouldn't trade Rybacker for him. No, just no. I'm gonna take this one because I don't know who sent this. Is this on the side of? Is that the Twitter handle?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is from on the side of on X, asking us to expand on what we said last week on PLD, specifically about the Habs not being really interested in him and feeling forced to make an offer. I must admit that part was very puzzling to me. Forced by who exactly? Jeff Molson. Then he goes into kind of a background of what happened there. And so, no, there was no pressure from Jeff Molson, at least not to my understanding. I meant that a situation was created where a player that seemingly would help the Canadiens compete and would improve the Canadiens became available and had publicly stated his desire to play for the Canadiens, and was not only just any player, but was a player from Quebec who speaks French, who is exactly everything the Canadiens should be hoping to achieve or to get. A big, skilled forward who could play wing and center and speak both official languages of Canada, and really checks a lot of boxes for this team. Now, that's what I meant in the sense of feeling forced. That no one was forcing them. What was forcing them was the circumstances, and that it would be tough for them to just simply say no to this player, even if he didn't fit the timeline of the rebuild, even if the assets necessary to get him were going to be difficult to match, and all these things, and the contract was going to be onerous, which obviously has turned out to be the case with Los Angeles. So all of these things were concerns for the Canadiens, but there was an opportunity there, and the opportunity forced them to explore it. Is what I meant to say. Like, that's the clarification, is that they felt forced because of everything that I listed earlier, but the trade cost and the contract cost and how it would throw their entire salary structure out of whack, and it would not fit what they had been planning to do. But sometimes you need to pivot from what you plan to do based on opportunities arising, and the Canadiens are going to do that again as they move forward. Opportunities are going to come up that they didn't necessarily plan for, and as we were saying earlier, they want to be in a position to be able to react to those opportunities and take advantage of them when they come. This was one of those opportunities that, frankly, all things being equal, they probably didn't want to be involved in, but they had to be, just because of the public nature of Pat Brisson saying what he said at the draft in Montreal, and then all the reports, and it just, they became part of the story, and they couldn't just say, we're not interested in this player. The public backlash over that would have been over the top. And yes, the questioner said this is an administration that generally doesn't seem to be influenced by public pressure. That's true, but they do care what their fans think about, and they care. I think there's an acute level of caring about this specific issue of getting homegrown Quebecois players on the team who are impact players and who can be voices in the community and can be spokespeople for the team. This will always be important to the administration, to the Canadiens franchise, to Jeff Molson as an owner. It's an important reality that they operate under that I think made them feel somewhat, quote unquote, forced to be involved in those talks. But all's well that ends well, that it didn't actually work out.
Indeed.
Yeah.
All right. Peter Menudarakos is asking us, a lot have been said about the top six going into next season and what UFA trade targets Hughes will be going after. Nothing has been said, though, about the bottom of the lineup. I understand there isn't a lot of roster spots the way currently stands. Hughes did mention at the season ends press conference about adding more scoring and getting more physical. I would like to get your opinions about the following players or what he could do there. And so Peter cites William Carrier, Brendan Duchesne, Yakov Trenin, and Dakota Joshua. Who's
I think he means Brendan. I think he means Brandon Duhaime.
Yeah, Duhaime. Yeah, not Duchesne.
Yes.
Duhaime. Yes.
Yes.
Exactly. Yes. Thank you. All right. So I think that these players, I would love to have a guy like William Carrier or Dakota Joshua on my team. There's no doubt about that. And I think the Canadiens would love to have
any of those guys. Yeah, any of those guys. Yeah.
I think it's just a matter of, is it a luxury that you can afford? A guy like Carrier is going to be a UFA at the end of this season. He won the Stanley Cup before, and he's been an impactful player in a albeit limited role, but he's been an impactful player for Vegas for a long time. I think he's the longest standing Vegas Golden Knight, if I'm not mistaken, or among.
Well, Marchessault, Carlson. He's one of the original misfits.
One of the original, yeah. So, but the thing is, the guy is playing a robust style, and he's 29 years old. If you have to, when you go after that sort of player, it's because you think that you're right in the middle of your window, and this is a missing piece for the puzzle that you've assembled. You were talking about painting with a roller earlier. Well, a guy like that is making sure that it fits in one of your corners or in the edges.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
It's a nice trim.
Yeah.
But he's not a foundational piece. And when those guys who are arriving into free agency, a guy like Carrier, for example, you have to wonder: are you the team, because of what he's done so far, he's going to get overpaid? And has he already given his best years, considering his style of play and the age that he has? So, and the same could be said for any of those guys. Dakota Joshua might be on some people's radar for the first time, but he was a draft pick, for Toronto Maple Leafs draft pick in 2014. He was traded to St. Louis for future considerations years ago, and he flourished under Rick Tuckett. He was the coach that he needed, but it's just a great story. All this to say, I think that the Canadiens, as much as they would like to have that sort of player, attracting them and investing money on those players is just not where the team is in his build. And it might be another 2-3 years before they really focus on that. And in the meantime, if they could develop a guy like that, if Luke Tuck could turn into this, if who knows, Lucas Condotta could turn into this, or a thing like that, a player of that sort, that'd be great. Or Florian Jacki. Right now, that's where the focus is. Do we have a William Carrier in our group? Do we have a Dakota Joshua? I think that'll be their focus right now.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that in principle, the Canadiens would like to get more physical and tougher and add the elements that each of those guys add. But yeah, it's not. And Ken Hughes made a point of mentioning, can we do that internally? That's what we're going to have to find out. So, I think that's going to be like door A is let's see what we have in internally, and let's see if we can make some room for them on the NHL roster so we can test them out. That's where they're at in their process. This is.
But when you're committed to door A, when you decide to see first what you've got in house, it means that you don't make any ad over the course of the summer, because
not for that type of player, because you don't want to do. Look at the contract that the Leafs gave Ryan Reeves. Not different circumstances. The context is completely different, but sometimes those players who have shown an ability to excel in a bottom six role in a winning environment command term, and maybe not Ryan Reeves money, but money. And it's the Canadiens are not in a position to do either of those things right now. So, and again, the roller analogy still applies. Hey, listen, Mark Antoine,
is that why you have all those off-season primer and playoff primer articles? Because it's yet again another painting analogy? No?
Well, I think you could argue the Canadiens are still applying primer right now. Yeah. Maybe they're not even at the roller stage. All right, we've passed the 90-minute mark, so I think it's time to wrap it up. Yeah. Okay. And so thanks everyone for listening. Obviously, we'll be back next Monday. Keep the mailbag questions coming in, Basu and Godin at gmail.com or at Basu and Godin on X. We'll see what we can cook up for next week, because obviously the Canadiens are having their scouting meeting. Marc Antoine and I are both, I guess, heading to the combine, but that's not even close. No. So we're gonna figure some stuff out. But I think keep enjoying watching the playoffs. And I know that I watch the playoffs with a certain eye towards work. Like I do like just watching hockey games where I don't have to work. But I would encourage all of you, just kind of when you watch the playoffs, look for the qualities of the team. Like, what are the teams doing that's giving them success in the playoffs, and how does that apply to the Montreal Canadiens? And maybe by this time next week, we might have a clearer picture of what the conference finals are going to look like, and maybe we can look at them from a Canadiens perspective as well.
You got to stay up late for Dallas, Colorado, because
it's worth it. It's worth it. It's worth it. I'll take that over the extra 2 hours sleep. I will take that.
Yeah. I've taken that already. Can you see under my eyes? I've been lacking sleep for weeks now. All right, everybody. And don't forget, if you're listening to us on Apple Podcasts, don't hesitate to drop a 5-star rating, a comment maybe. It's always appreciated. It makes the algorithm, it makes us easier to find for people that might not know about us. So that's it. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.